Hello, and welcome to this week's email, which is called, Are We Shaping Our Children's World in the Best Way Possible? I hope you've had a great week, full of finger and toe tapping after last week's email. Thanks to those of you who took the time to write to me to tell me how interesting you found the content to be. It's always great to know when an email, video or written, lands resonantly. We're going to continue our summer reading series now by turning to look briefly at a big societal issue through the lens of a father's musings on his young daughter's experiences. The format of the email remains the same as last week's. We start with a bit of background context and then move into the discovery phase before finishing with a very brief summary of the personal ways in which I've tried to incorporate my learning into my own practice. So let's make a start with the background context. What was I looking for when I fell down this particular rabbit hole? Since setting off on my most recent diversity journey in late 2020, when I began to realise that the songs I had created were such valuable tools in raising young children's awareness of their similarities and differences, I knew that I needed to learn more about child development in terms of how discrimination and bias are formed in the early stages of life. I cast around to find the most current and pertinent research relating to this and came to discover that there wasn't much quality literature and research readily available on this topic, although this situation is rapidly improving now. My attention was caught by the writings of Ibram X Kendi, an American author, professor and anti-racist activist. He published a book in 2022 called How to Raise an Anti-Racist, where he described his own experiences as a new parent during the time that his daughter grew from infancy into young childhood. Although his accounts obviously focus on racism, I realised, whilst reading the book, that these experiences are totally transferable when it comes to other issues related to equity, inclusivity, and accessibility. His writing has stayed with me ever since, and I now try even harder to be aware and appreciative of my surroundings and my environment in terms of how they are impacting upon the experiences of the young children I interact with. Am I always providing the best, most representative set of resources for the children in my care? And that moves us on to number 2. What important facts have I chosen to share with you? As with all the books I've read, I basically want to tell you about absolutely everything I discovered, but obviously I can't. Therefore, I'll just share with you a few standout moments here. One of those for me is the way Kendi talks about his child's changing experiences through her different stages of development. For example, he notes that in her preschool setting, he found her playing with a set of dolls, which were all white-skinned and female. They were certainly not representative of the world in which she was growing up, but at the time, he didn't think to immediately challenge the lack of representation it revealed. Another broader example he cites is related to that of teaching children to cross the road. He argues that educators always teach children about the invisible dangers this imposes on them. In fact, the teachers wouldn't be doing their job properly if they didn't. They warn of those dangers, teaching the children to look out for, recognise and identify such possible threats, and then offer them strategies to safely deal with them. He goes on to propose that racism, discrimination and bias should be treated in exactly the same way. Just because they are a social set of invisible influences swirling around the children, they shouldn't be ignored and swept under the carpet as something that doesn't need to be discussed. He quotes the sociologist Margaret A. Hagerman as saying, "Kids make sense of the world around them through the observations they make and to the interactions they have within the confines of their everyday lives. What happens at schools, soccer practice, birthday parties, clarinet lessons, and in the back seat of a car shapes children's ideas about the social world." Kendi goes on page 180, to say, "Children are trying to figure out why even before they can talk in full sentences. What is their environment telling them in verbal and non-verbal language? But the child-proofing of the racial environment is all for naught if caretakers don't actively raise children as early as they can to be empathetic. If caregivers don't realise that by the time children enter preschool, they already have an adult-like grasp of race. If caregivers don't inject into the children the antibodies of anti-racist education to protect them. If caregivers don't ensure this education is teaching children to be critical thinkers. Preparing the child to protect herself is not enough. The ultimate way to protect our children from racism is to protect all children from racism. The ultimate way to protect all children from racism is to eliminate racism. And to do that, we have to do more than raise anti-racist children. We have to raise an anti-racist society. And this moves us on to the third point. Why have I found this helpful, and how can I apply it to my own practice? I found this book helpful as it made me pause to consider, 1, the fact that there are so many invisible influences continually shaping our lives that we're unaware of, and 2, without the chance to stop and think or reflect on our normalised behaviours, maybe we are guilty of letting some of these negative nuances slip by unnoticed. Kendi certainly did in the case of the doll example, and I'm sure I could present a range of examples from my own teaching practice over the years where my teaching resources may not have been adequately representative. The thing is, even Kendi hasn't managed to get it right all the time, which is so reassuring in itself. We all just have to keep on trying. Just as an aside to this, I've realised that since reading Kendi's book, I'm far more aware of the negative societal influences at play around us, and I now read and digest other information with a much more receptive and thoughtful mind. Perhaps that's why, when I came across an article this week by the award-winning journalist Carole Cadwalladr, and see the link below this video, my diversity antennae stuck straight up as I saw her words, "Misogyny is invisible." And earlier in the article, the phrase, "misogyny plus racism, the most toxic combination of all." Without wanting to sound too alarmist here, I do believe there's an increasing urgency to the diversity work that we're doing now to create the exemplary diversity ambassadors of the future that we seem to so desperately need. Returning to Kendi, I'll leave him to suggest a final thought. Like so many of us today, I had to learn as an adult what I could have learned as a child. I had to learn I wasn't the racial problem. I had to learn no racial group has more because they are more. No racial group has less because they are less. Imagine if every child learned to see the racial inequity in their community from this anti-racist point of view. How protective it would be for kids to learn about bad rules and not bad people for once. Wishing you a thoughtful and sensitive week ahead, and thanks for watching. See you next time.